My name is Kim Hisson, and I am the Executive Director of the Office of Annual Giving and Laurentian Engagement here at St. Lawrence. And we're excited to be offering a lecture tonight as part of our Laurentian for Life Week celebration, and in particular our Laurentians Learn theme of the day. Before we get started, I'd like to cover just a few technical items that should help make your webinar experience a more enjoyable one. Periodically throughout the webinar, we will pause and invite comments and questions, and you will be able to virtually raise your hand using the hand icon in the bar to the left of the navigation pane that you should see at the top right of your screen. The icon is a small hand in blue towards the bottom of that bar. You click it once to raise your hand, and when you're called on, you'll be unmuted and have the opportunity to ask your question. You also have the ability to type in your question. In between the question and answer periods, we will mute all participants to avoid the noise interference. Just a few tips about the webinar audio. If you happen to be using the audio through your computer, just know that you must have a built-in microphone or an external microphone in order to ask questions. Otherwise, you'll be able to hear us, but unfortunately, we won't be able to hear you. If you're using the audio through your telephone, if you have your phone on speaker during the webinar, in order for us to hear your questions, you will likely need to take the speaker off during that time and use your handset. We recommend that during the presentation you minimize the navigation pane by using the orange arrow near the top to minimize the pane, and if you need to maximize it at any time to ask a question, simply use the orange arrow to maximize it to fuller screen. So without further delay, I am pleased to introduce our lecturer for the evening, Dr. Fred Exu, the Charles D., Sarah, and John D. Munsell Professor of Government. Dr. Exu is a specialist in the politics of the mass media. He is the author of The Pen and the Sword, Press War and Terror in the 21st Century, and he is also the author of Democracy Upside Down, Public Opinion and Cultural Hegemony in the United States, and of The Politics of the Mass Media. In spring of 2009, Dr. Exu was chosen outstanding faculty member by the senior class. His commentary and articles have appeared in such publications as the New York Times, the Times London, the Los Angeles Times, New Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and the Huffington Post. You can find Dr. Exu's full biography on the St. Lawrence University website. Tonight's lecture is entitled The Root of All Evil, How Private Money is Wrecking American Politics. So I'll now turn it over to Dr. Exu. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Kim. It's wonderful to be here. Let me start by thanking the Alumni Office for putting this event together, and especially thanking Kim Hisson, who's with us here tonight and who I happen to personally know has spent weekends and evenings working on this project. So thanks to you especially, Kim. Then let me thank our audience for tuning in, and let me say what a wonderful blessing and a privilege and a pleasure it is to be with you tonight. My engagement over the last 36 years with St. Lawrence students has been one of the great joys of my life. And some of those students have gone on to become lifelong friends, and what a pleasure it is to have some of my lifelong alumni friends in the audience tonight. There are others in our audience tonight whom I've never had a chance to meet, and I am so excited to have the opportunity to have this engagement with you. If you'll indulge me, in fact, let me read you what I wrote about my St. Lawrence students and alumni in the acknowledgments section of my last book. So you'll know I'm not just blowing smoke at you tonight. I said this publicly. It says, to my students at St. Lawrence University, for making mine the most wonderful job in the world. When I say, this is my truth, now tell me yours, you let me hear your voices, which are by turns so brilliant, so thoughtful, so funny, so decent, so humane. Thank you, my students, for reassuring an aging man that the future is in such good hands. Well, needless to say, I'm eager to hear your voices again tonight. So let's proceed this way. There are 3 sections in my talk tonight. Each one will take only 12 to 15 minutes. The last one might be just a bit longer. But after each section, so coming up in probably 10 or 15 minutes, let's take a break for questions. Kim, why don't we take them in the order in which they come, maybe either by raising a hand or writing us in a question. So put your hand up or write your question in as soon as you can, and we will get to those in 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to begin tonight with a section on who owns our government. Then we're going to watch as the making of a policy in Washington becomes a story of corruption. And finally, we'll go to the macro level, arguing that overall special interest money in politics is driving the huge increases in inequality that we've witnessed in our time, and that special interest money is killing the American dream. So let's start with the question, who owns our government? And thank you, Kim. Who owns our government? And so let's ask ourselves, do the demos have the kratos? Those are Greek words, meaning do the people, the demos, have the power, that is the kratos, so that we are a democracy? Or does someone else own our government? Perhaps the plutos, those people with a great deal of wealth, so that we are a plutocracy. Now, we're going to be talking in this section about conflict between social classes. So let me make an important point about what I am not saying. This is emphatically not an argument about the evil, greedy rich pursuing their selfish interests versus a noble middle class which just wants what's best for everybody. The truth on this is, James Madison was right. In politics, most of us, most of the time, pursue our own material interests. There's plenty of evidence to support that theory. So, do the rich pursue their own interests in politics? We'll see that they do, but so do the rest of us. See, I was raised as a Calvinist, so I have some affection for the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity, which is best summed up by a line from a Clint Eastwood movie. In the movie Unforgiven, Clint's sidekick, the kid, asks Clint, that guy we shot, he was a bad guy, right? He had it coming? And Eastwood replies, kid, we all got it coming. Well, there it is, the doctrine of total depravity in 6 laconic words. Great movie, check it out. So the question I am raising is not, should the evil rich have power or the noble middle class? That's not a question that makes much sense to me. Now, the question is really, which system of government do we have, a democracy or a plutocracy, and which one do we prefer? Which one works better for us? Let's start with a document that was leaked. This document was not supposed to be made public. It was supposed to be kept hidden for reasons that will be obvious in just a minute. Excuse me. This document was circulated to newly elected Democratic congresspeople as part of their orientation on how to be a congressperson. We don't have a comparable document from the Republican side, but there's no reason to think it would look much different from this document. The document, as you can see, tells congresspeople how they should be spending their day, how much time to devote to which activities. Notice, if you will, that 4 hours a day is spent on call time. What's that? Well, it's sometimes called dialing for dollars. As a congressperson, you are expected to be on the phone talking to wealthy donors 4 hours every day, raising campaign funds. Then there's another hour of strategic outreach, breakfasts, meet and greets, and so on. And who are you strategic outreaching to? Well, once again, many of these functions are fundraising events. So congresspeople are told to spend close to 5 hours a day talking to wealthy donors. Now, let me ask us a question. Do you think that talking in a friendly, ingratiating way to a particular, very small group of people in society for 5 hours a day, people whose donations you need very badly, might this have the effect of slanting a congressperson's opinions in favor of that group of people? Would a congressperson begin to see the world as the rich see it under those circumstances? Congresswoman Leslie Byrne says that when she first came to Congress, a senior colleague gave her this advice: always lean to the green. And, she adds, he was not an environmentalist. Notice that the document also suggests doing floor and committee work for 2 hours a day, and then meeting with constituents for 1 or 2 hours a day. Now, these kinds of things, studying issues in committee, being on the floor for important votes and debates, these things are the job that you folks are paying Congress to do. So to summarize this table, Congress is spending 3 or 4 hours a day, the minority of its day, on the job that you and I are paying them to do. And then Congress is spending 4 or 5 hours a day, the majority of their day, on what, in a sense, rich people are paying them to do. That is, to talk to rich people, to hear their concerns, and presumably to act on those concerns. Next, let's ask the question, well, who are these folks getting most of Congress's time? The first thing to know is that it's a very, very small slice of the population. As Lawrence Lessig has pointed out, only 0.26%, and this data is on our chart, only 0.26% of Americans, that's 1/4%, gave as much as even $200 to a candidate for federal office in recent elections. Only 0.05% gave the maximum amount allowed to a candidate for federal office. Currently, that maximum is $2,600 per election. Only 0.01%, that's the top 1% of the 1%, gave $10,000 or more. And finally, my favorite statistic on this chart, 0.000042% of the population, that's a total of 132 Americans, gave 60% of all super PAC contributions. Together, this cell-thin slice of the population, far less than 1% of the population, gave 63% of all campaign contributions. Okay, so the people Congress is talking to are a very small slice of the population. But let's ask another question. Are these folks different from most Americans, or are their opinions pretty much like other people's, so that when Congress talks to wealthy people, they're hearing concerns that are shared by many of us? The answer is that, politically speaking, F. Scott Fitzgerald was right when he wrote, "The rich are different from you and me." The table we're now seeing is a comparison of the policy attitudes of the wealthiest Americans, defined as having incomes over $1 million per year, compared to the attitudes of all other Americans. As we can see, the differences are stark. For example, on the statement regarding an issue that's on the front burner right now, the minimum wage should be set high enough so that no family with a full-time worker falls below the poverty level. Almost 8 out of 10 Americans say yes to that, but only a distinct minority, 40%, of the wealthiest Americans agree. Now let me be clear about what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that the rich are wrong and the other Americans are right about these issues. We'd have to do a lot more thinking about these issues to figure all that out. What I am saying is simply that when Congress people talk to wealthy donors for 4 or 5 hours a day, they are not hearing the opinions of most Americans. They are hearing the opinions of a very small slice of the population whose opinions are in fact very different from the opinions of most Americans. And yes, to answer our earlier question, dialing for dollars for 5 hours a day does have an effect on those Congress people. Princeton political scientist Larry Bartels reports on a research that measured congruence. And what congruence means is agreement. Agreement this time between U.S. senators and their constituents. Turns out that senators were most likely to be in agreement with their wealthiest constituents. Senators were 50% less likely to agree with their middle-class constituents. And finally, between senators and low-income constituents, the researchers said agreement was non-existent. How come? Well, Bartel says, middle-class people vote at the same rate as the rich. They also contact public officials. They write letters to the editor. They participate generally at the same rate as the wealthy do. Poor people do a bit less of this kind of participation, but not nearly so much as to account for the huge difference in congruence. On the other hand, says Bartels, there is one political activity that clearly distinguishes the rich from other voters, and that is making campaign contributions. Here, says Bartels, the disparity between classes is extreme and matches the differences in responsiveness of senators to the rich, middle class, and poor. So does relying on the very rich in order to keep their jobs skew congresspeople toward agreeing with the very rich about policy? It appears to be yes, it does. It turns out that Alexander Hamilton was right when he wrote, "In the main, it will be found that a power over a man's support is a power over his will." At this point, let me take a pause and see if we have any questions.
Okay, we're going to take a look and see if anyone has their hand raised and would actually like to ask Dr. Exu a question aloud. So we'll look down through there. I think we do. Meredith Wahid. Meredith, go ahead and ask your question or make your comment.
I tried to, I did not intend to raise my hand. I don't know how to work this webinar program.
Okay, that's okay. No problem.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. We'll move along and see. It looks like Sally McGinn. Sally, do you have a comment or a question? Sally, go ahead. Okay, we'll come back to Sally in just a moment. Okay, let's try Skip Hansen. Skip, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead and ask your question or make your comment.
Okay, can you hear me?
You can.
You can.
Okay, good. So if you go back to that prior slide where you showed, I don't know if it'll show up here, but so you showed the percentages of who agreed with what. But I'm wondering, when you look at the rich and you divide it by Democrat versus Republican, do the Democrats tend to support issues differently than the Republicans, and therefore do they tend to balance each other out to a certain extent?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
I certainly do, Skip, and very good question, sure. As we saw from our data when we had it up there, Kim's got it back up there for us. As we saw from our data, the rich are not a completely homogeneous group like everybody else. There is variation among them in what they believe and think. And in fact, some of them are Democrats and some of them are donors to the Democratic Party, and some of them take more liberal positions. Does that get at your question, Skip? We'll hope that it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, there we go. Okay, so it does more or less answer the question. I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, so, I mean, clearly the rich spend a whole lot of time trying to influence government and apparently do a reasonably good job of influencing people that they're donating to. That makes a whole lot of sense. So then the question is, how come the rich don't always get their way? And it's, because I think there's a whole lot of things. Obamacare would never have gotten passed if the majority of the Republican rich people had their way, clearly. Okay, so what happened? So somehow, there is sort of a balancing out of this in the sense of the liberal versus the conservative views at the rich end, and then how it filters down into the rest of the voting populace.
Yeah, I'm going to make the argument tonight, Skip, that the wealthy and the corporate sector have embarked on a rather massive political offensive that has them in our time getting their way most of the time. And I'm actually going to use Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act as a case study of that. And I'll be providing lots more policies where I think the wealthy have prevailed in recent years, and in fact where poor people and working class people have not done so well in terms of public policy in recent years.
Okay. We've got a couple of people asking just technical questions. Do I need to call in to speak? And just to clarify again on how to ask a question or make a comment, on your navigation pane to the right, you should see the option of typing in a question or raising your hand. And there is an icon of a small hand in yellow that should appear in your screen. It may actually be blue on your screen. So if you have a question, you can do one of those two things. Let's see. We do have a question here that was typed in. It says, isn't gerrymandering undermining the democratic process? Virginia has gone in the last 4 national and statewide elections, yet our legislator and congressional delegation is Republican only because of gerrymandering.
Yeah, sure. So let's define gerrymandering quickly. Gerrymandering is the drawing of election districts in such a way as to favor one party over the other. Both parties are certainly capable of gerrymandering. The Republican Party has had more success with gerrymandering recently because you have to be in control of your state government. It's state governments that draw district lines, election district lines. And if you're in control of your state government, you're the party that gets to do that. Well, Republicans have controlled more state governments recently, and especially around 2010 when the new census data came in and the new election districts were drawn. And in some states, they managed to successfully gerrymander those states so that Republicans will get more seats than they would simply as a percentage of the vote. And yeah, gerrymandering is an issue. You know, I think most of us would probably like to see the drawing of election districts done not by the party that happens to be in power, but by some bipartisan or nonpartisan consultant based on, you know, certain principles that are laid out, like you want districts to be contiguous, you know, you want them to include a whole city at one time, and so on. States aren't moving too fast to that because, again, both parties like it when they get a chance to gerrymander. And so they're a bit reluctant to move to a system of consultants doing the drawing of election districts.
It looks like we have another question being asked via the virtual hand raise. So Carrie Hazelton, if you'd like to go ahead and make your comment or ask your question.
Yes, hello. I was just wondering what the percentage effect is, or what the exacerbating level is based on the most recent Supreme Court decision opening the floodgates of the money. Has that made things that much worse? Is that why we're seeing such an acceleration of this flight to money and increase in just hatred amongst members of our government, one to another, across party lines?
Okay. Great question, Carrie. And I think what you're probably referring to is the Citizens United versus
exactly, yeah.
case. That case and a couple of companion cases that the Supreme Court has recently decided. Now, the main thing everybody thought that Citizens United did was to grant personhood, in other words, to corporations, and allow corporations and labor unions to spend as much as they wanted to from their own funds on campaign commercials if they wanted, right up until Election Day. Citizens United knocked down that part of the McCain-Feingold law that had prohibited that. A lot of people thought a lot of corporate money would flood in, and a lot has, in fact. But corporations are a little worried about their public image. They don't want to be seen as too partisan, because if Colgate is too partisan in a direction toward the Democrats, then Republicans won't buy their toothpaste. So they have done it on the sly. Now, the other major impact of Citizens United and other recent court cases is simply to send a broad signal to potential donors and campaign spenders. And the signal says this Supreme Court sees spending as speaking, and therefore spending is protected by the First Amendment. So if you want to spend money on a campaign, you go right ahead and do it. That's really what unleashed the floodgates, people's campaign finance attorneys saying to them, go ahead and spend the money, this court is going to support you.
And so if the power leans towards the money, doesn't that mean that my one vote is now a smaller vote than a corporation or a union or a super PAC can then make? And how am I then, how is my vote, how am I an equal citizen under Citizens United?
Well, I guess the power of money comes in two places, I would say, Carrie, and another great question, by the way. First of all, it's sometimes called the first primary. So before any voter ever steps into any voting booth, the so-called first primary is, how did you do with the fundraisers? And if you didn't cut it with the fundraisers, you don't have a campaign. So they exercise a sort of primordial power right at the beginning. And then, of course, it's their campaign ads that are directed toward trying to influence us as voters. So they get a second crack at the process. Not only do they, in a sense, choose who the candidates will be, but they choose who the winner will be, or at least exercise a lot of influence over who the winner is going to be by showing us those campaign commercials and persuading voters with them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carrie.
It looks like we might be able to take another question or two. Let's see. We've got just a technical question saying, can we have copies of the tables and charts? Afterwards, we will have the PowerPoint presentation that will be available, so you'll be able to reference those. We've got another question or comment here from Patrick Sheridan Rossi. It says, would it be safe to say that big money donors would be more inclined to donate to a third party, i.e. rather than a candidate, because the IEs can be far more aggressive in their tactics during the campaign season?
Yes. So Pat's talking here about the difference between, if I'm reading his question right, and thank you, Pat, for your question. Good to hear from you. Pat is a political professional, so he'll be asking us good questions. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Kim, read me that question.
Sure, absolutely. Yep. It said, would it be safe to say that big money donors would be more inclined to donate to third party? Yes.
Sure. So I take it Pat is asking, would big money donors donate to a super PAC, for example, rather than to a candidate's campaign? Now, a super PAC produces its own commercials. And I think what Pat's suggesting is that a super PAC is more free to campaign in a hard-hitting way, maybe in a below-the-belt way, and certainly to go very negative, because it's not the candidate, him or herself, that has to take responsibility for all that. So if you go back, for example, to the 1988 campaign, when the George Bush campaign was thinking about using Willie Horton as an exemplar of Mike Dukakis's weakness as governor, Willie Horton was a black man who had committed a heinous crime under a furlough program run by Mike Dukakis. So the Bush campaign itself, and this goes to Pat's point, the Bush campaign itself ran a rather color-neutral commercial about the furlough program and about this murder that had taken place. Didn't show a picture of Willie Horton. Then an independent expenditure group working on behalf of the Bush campaign showed a commercial that played, I think it's fair to say, rather nakedly on the fears of white people about black crime. It showed a picture of Willie Horton, who was a fairly kind of scary-looking guy. It dwelled on the crime at length. His picture was up for most of the commercial. A lot of people said that ad was race baiting, but the Bush commercial was not. So Bush had clean hands and still got the advantage of the below-the-belt commercial.
We have another comment or question here from Ginny Manuel. It says that the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson don't seem too concerned about their image. By the way, shouldn't Justices Thomas and Scalia have recused themselves from Citizens United case because of personal ties to the Koch brothers?
Right. And in fact, talking about conflicts of interest on the Supreme Court, it gets even worse in the case of Clarence Thomas, I think, because his wife has worked for an organization that lobbied heavily against the Affordable Care Act, and so people wondered if he should be sitting in on that decision, on that decision. And yeah, the several Supreme Court members have attended soirees hosted by the Koch brothers. I'm not sure that rises to the level of conflict of interest. Some Supreme Court members take fees for speaking at these events, and there it seems a little bit more perhaps like a conflict of interest. And Kim, can you remind me what the first part of that question was again?
Yes, it was a comment about the actual Koch brothers. So let's see. I don't think I can bring that back up now that we've gone past it. Sorry about that. Let's see. Would we like to take a couple more comments and questions right now, or keep moving and come back to them after the next?
Maybe we should go to the next section.
Okay, and we'll keep the hands up and we'll come back to those. Okay.
All right, thank you, Kim. Well, for our next few minutes, that's good, off to a great start. For our next few minutes, let me tell you a story. This is a story about politics. It's about campaign finance, and as we'll see, it's a story of corruption. It's an important story because the corruption is of democracy itself, and it involves a selling out of the public good to private interests for money. It's not an anomalous story, unfortunately. It's not an unusual story. It is instead a story about how our government now routinely works in ways that undermine the public good day in and day out. Our story begins in 2003 when Congress passes President Bush's biggest social legislation, the Medicare Prescription Drug Act. This was a very nice benefit for seniors, ensuring them access to sometimes costly medications. As a rising senior myself, I thank the former president and Congress. Also, as a rising senior, I can't wait for Senior Week, when other seniors and I will use the word party as a verb. In fact, let me ask our retired audience members, is retirement like having Senior Week all the time? Well, back to our story. The bill did something nice for seniors, but the bill did something even nicer for someone else. That was pharmaceutical manufacturers. The third most profitable business in the country was about to get a lot more profitable because the legislation included a provision saying that the federal government was prohibited from bargaining with the drug companies over the price of drugs. Put another way, the federal government was required to pay whatever price the drug companies dictated. Now let's make sure we understand this situation. The federal government is about to become, in 2003, one of the biggest purchasers of pharmaceutical products in the world. This gives the government bargaining power. We all understand why Walmart can give us everyday low prices. It's because Walmart is the biggest retailer and one of the biggest purchasers of wholesale goods in the world. That gives Walmart the bargaining power to say to, let's say, Levi Jeans, give us 1 million pairs of jeans at $2.99 a pair. And Levi's may say, gee, that leaves us with a pretty small markup from our manufacturing costs on each pair of jeans, but it is 1 million pairs. Walmart is a huge retailer, so we'll still make money. In other words, a buyer the size of Walmart can bargain down the cost of goods. Well, the U.S. government had become a buyer the size of Walmart and could have bargained down the cost of pharmaceuticals a great deal. The markup, by the way, on our drugs in the United States is astronomical. Those of you who have traveled abroad and had to buy a medication abroad understand that they cost considerably less there. It is estimated that we as taxpayers could have saved about $30 billion in the first 10 years of the program if the government had been able to bargain. As it was, with the government's hands tied, the bill cost us an estimated $600 billion over its first 10 years, and it added significantly to the federal debt. Now, maybe this was an instance of corruption. After all, the President and Congress gave a big fat kiss to an industry that had given out lots of campaign contributions. In fact, Big Pharma had spent nearly $500 million on lobbying and campaign contributions between 2000 and 2003, as our chart shows us. On the other hand, maybe this was not corruption. Maybe the President and Congress felt that the pharmaceutical industry could be trusted to charge a fair price, although the first thing the drug companies did when the law went into effect was to raise their prices by about 4%. But maybe Congress felt the drug companies needed to be paid a huge markup so that they could do research on new drugs. So maybe this was just Congress's idea of good public policy. But now, ladies and gentlemen, we get to Act 2 of our story, where corruption is going to step right out on center stage and announce itself. Act 2 begins with Barack Obama, who, as a U.S. Senator, did not like the big wet kiss given to Big Pharma. This, and I'm quoting him, "This was just another example," he said, "of the power and profits of the pharmaceutical industry trumping good policy and the will of the American people." Later, when he ran for president, Obama's website promised that he would repeal the ban on negotiations with drug companies and use the savings to promote better health care for all Americans. In a campaign commercial, Obama inveighed in particular against the payoff that was given to Congressman Billy Tozan, whose picture we're seeing right now. The payoff that was given to Congressman Billy Tozan was a Cajun good old boy from Louisiana who was chair of the House Commerce Committee at the time and who engineered the terms and the passage of the Medicare bill. Now, by payoff, here's what I mean. Shortly after the bill was passed, Billy Tozan left Congress to take a new job as chief lobbyist for the pharmaceutical manufacturers at a salary of $2 million per year. By the way, Tozan is not alone. In the 1970s, only 3% of congressmen left Congress to become lobbyists. Today, about 50, that's 50% of U.S. senators go through this revolving door to become lobbyists when they leave Congress, at an average salary increase, folks, of 1,452%. So a lucrative lobbying career is now the brass ring you catch at the end of a stint in Congress. But you don't catch the brass ring unless you've been nice, as Billy Tozan was, to the industries that you'll be lobbying for. Jack Abramoff, the lobbyist who went to jail for bribing congressmen, has written that his most effective bribe was perfectly legal. It was to say to a congressman or a staffer, "Where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? Because I could see you working for me at a salary 15 times what you're making now." After that, said Abramoff, I had that congressman or staffer in my pocket. In his campaign commercial, Obama described Tozan's journey this way, and I'm quoting Obama again. "And you know, the chairman of the committee who pushed the law through went to work for the pharmaceutical industry, making $2 million a year. Imagine that. That's an example of the same old game playing in Washington. You know, said Obama, I don't want to learn how to play the game better. I want to put an end to game playing. So now Obama, the reformer, has risen up to slay the dragon of corruption. But ladies and gentlemen, this is not a fairy tale. This is U.S. politics in the 21st century, where usually the dragon slays the reformer, and so it will be in this tale. Because within just a few months of the 2008 election, Barack Obama has announced that his first major domestic initiative will be health care reform. Millions of previously uninsured Americans will now have health insurance. Some of those millions will be covered by the U.S. government under a large expansion of Medicaid. Once again, the U.S. government will become an even bigger buyer of pharmaceutical medications. Surely this will be the place, the Affordable Care Act, where Obama the reformer restores the power of the federal government to bargain down prices with Big Pharma and saves taxpayers billions. Ah, but wait. Who is this visitor to the White House? One of the first to be invited to discuss the health care bill with the president. Why, it's none other than our old friend Billy Tauzin. Now the chief lobbyist of the pharmaceutical industry, the man Obama had inveighed against. And here he is dictating the terms of a deal to Obama. If you don't want Big Pharma lining up against you, was Tauzin's message, with all of our advertising and campaign finance muscle, give us the same deal that you promised to put an end to. Ban the federal government in the Affordable Care Act from bargaining for lower costs from drug companies. Make the taxpayer pay whatever the drug companies demand. Obama knew that Tauzin's dictate carried a Godfather-like threat. It was an offer the president couldn't refuse. No, he wasn't going to wake up with a dead horse in his bed, but he might wake up with the dead Affordable Care Act. Obama knew well that when Bill Clinton had proposed health care reform without the blessing of a major interest group, in that case the health insurance industry, they had mounted a relentless campaign of negative advertising that killed the bill in its crib. It never even got out of congressional committee. Some of you may remember Harry and Louise, the nice, average American family who perpetrated the infanticide of the Clinton health care reform. Kim, should we have just a couple of seconds of Harry and Louise?
This is covered under our old plan.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one, wasn't it?
Things are changing, and not all for the better. The government may force us to pick from a few health care plans designed by government bureaucrats.
Having choices we don't like is no choice at all.
They choose.
We're rude.
For reforms that protect what we have, call toll-free. Know the facts. If we let the government choose, we lose. Call today.
It's interesting, isn't it, to see that old commercial and notice that the themes have recurred with the debate over Obamacare. The theme of choice and the theme of affordability and so on. Obama, the reformer, looked the dragon in the eye and he blinked. He made the same corrupt deal that he had inveighed against with the very man whose corruption he had inveighed against. This time, there was no question. Obama is not someone who thought paying the drug company's price was good policy. He had been very public in saying that it was bad policy. And yet, he made the deal. Because such is the corrupting power of money, it had left Obama with a Hobson's choice between a bad policy and no policy. Take our deal or we'll kill your bill. That was the offer that Billy Tauzin carried. Once again, the dragon had slain the knight errant because this was not a fairy tale. This was American politics as it has come to be in our time. Let me pause there again and ask if folks have some questions.
Okay, let's take a look and see who might have their hand raised or typed in a question. Okay, it looks like Mark Perlman has a comment or question. Mark, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You talked earlier about super PACs helping candidates, but in many ways, don't you think super PACs would actually manipulate candidates into what they believe, because the super PAC can support certain candidates in the primaries, even, and a general could just say, "We'll support you," but can, based on how much they supported the super PAC, it just shows how much level of ad funding they're going to go for that candidate.
If I'm hearing your question right, Mark, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sensing that the question is that super PACs can not only help a candidate, they can guide and perhaps even direct a candidate in the direction that candidate shall go. And there was certainly a classic example of that in the 2012 election. You might recall that Newt Gingrich was one of the Republican candidates during primary season. And I think it was Newt Gingrich that was singled out by Sheldon Adelson, who is, I think, the Las Vegas casino mogul. Sheldon Adelson has a particular interest in Israel and in supporting Israel. And once Newt Gingrich's campaign looked like it was kind of flatlining and he was in difficulty, Sheldon Adelson came to the rescue, and suddenly Newt Gingrich was all about Israel and supporting Israel and taking a very hard line in support of Israel. So I think it's a great example, Mark, of the kind of thing you're talking about, that super PACs have the power not just to support a candidate, but really to lead, guide, direct a candidate in the direction that they want.
Okay, let's see what we've got here for other questions or comments. We've got a few more hands and a few that have been typed in as well. Okay, we've got one here from Kathy, I think it's Nerger. It says, we can't get the truth of our government from advertising and not from major media. So where do we get the real story?
A great question. I would recommend looking at a variety of sources politically. The internet, I think, is a rich, immeasurably rich, really, text for us. You can certainly find arguments on the left and arguments on the right. You can find material that is written more thoughtfully and at greater length than the mainstream media will write it. My son and I have been writing for an online magazine called Salon, and it's been a wonderful experience because they don't limit you as a, if you write to the New York Times, you get maybe 500 words to do an op-ed piece. If you write for an online magazine, they'll let you go on at greater length and make a more intricate and better substantiated case. So I think the internet's a great resource, and I would simply suggest picking and choosing among the internet's possibilities.
Okay, just taking a look down through the list of attendees again, see if there are any additional hands raised or questions before we move ahead. Again, if you have a question, type it in or use the hand icon to raise your hand.
By the way, let me just say, I'm so glad questions are coming in, because this thing happened to me when I first got to St. Lawrence, where I wrote an editorial that got picked up by the Detroit News. And then a guy who ran a talk show on radio in Detroit wanted to have me on, and so I did the interview from my office on the telephone. And he and I chatted for a couple of minutes, and after that couple of minutes, he opened it up to questions from listeners, and there were no questions. And the DJ's response to this situation was to make me sound more extreme than I was. And so he would change the formulation of what I was saying each time. It finally got to the point, I think he was saying, Dr. Exo's talking about killing puppies here. Detroit, what do you think of that? Send us your phone. Yeah. So thank you for your question.
I think we have a question that you might have touched on before, but I'll just read it aloud in case you want to follow up on it in any way. It's from John Chisholm. It says, could you discuss the Citizens United court decision and its implication for leveraging the political voice of certain groups? Do you feel like you've covered that one completely, or did you want to say anything about that?
Just to amplify a little bit, certainly corporations are now allowed to be involved in the game in a way that they were not before. And I don't want to suggest that corporations have completely eschewed that possibility. They haven't. What they have tried to do, though, is to put their money in anonymously, and sometimes called dark money. So they might make a contribution, for example, to the United States Chamber of Commerce. And then the Chamber of Commerce will use that money to make campaign commercials for the corporation's favorite candidate. So there has been increased corporate money in addition to this other phenomenon of the court saying spending is speaking, so go ahead and spend, and the creation of super PACs.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions or hands raised at the moment, but we can come back again.
Great. We probably should press ahead with our third and final section. And our final chapter tonight takes us to the big picture level. What's private money doing overall to American politics? The argument is going to be that unchecked money has helped to drive the extreme inequality that now besets us. Our story begins in the 1970s, when simultaneously two important things were happening. The first thing that's happening is that the cost of campaigning has begun to increase sharply. Here's a statistic that will astonish you. Between 1896 and 1952, that's half a century, the cost of running a campaign for federal office stayed about the same, controlling for inflation. Stayed about the same for half a century. Then, beginning in the 1950s, the cost of campaigning begins to rise. By the 1970s, the cost of campaigning is increasing by 15% every 2 years. How come? Well, prior to this time, prior to the 1950s, campaigns had been carried by an army of party loyalists whose jobs often depended on winning these elections. But with the passage of civil service laws, that army of patronage workers was disappearing. So beginning in the 1950s, campaigns would now need to be carried by more expensive means. Television, which remains the big ticket item in the expense accounts of most campaigns, but also polling and focus groups and direct mail, campaign consultants to craft the message and create the TV ads. All of these are very expensive arts. And so money had always been important in American politics, but by the 70s, money had become crucial, vital, by far the most important weapon in your campaign arsenal. Now, the other thing that happened in the 1970s may at first seem unrelated to campaign finance, but as we'll see, it was about to become very relevant. This second development was the arrival of foreign competition on the U.S. doorstep. In the wake of World War II, the economies and the corporations of Japan and Europe were basket cases devastated by war. But partly due to U.S. help, those foreign companies had recovered by the 1960s. And so those foreign companies with names like Toyota, Sony, Saab, and Volkswagen were selling their products like hotcakes in the U.S. market. U.S. corporate profits fell hard. You can see on the chart we're now looking at that those profits began to fall in the mid-60s, and they were in a deep trough by the early 1970s. The American business community realized that to regain its profitability, it would need to get more. More from the government, for one thing. In a now famous manifesto, corporate attorney Lewis Powell, who was soon to become a Supreme Court justice, issued the challenge, calling for a multi-pronged corporate offensive on public opinion through the establishment of conservative think tanks and media outlets, as well as calling for a direct political offensive. I'm sorry, we should be looking at his screen. And here is what Lewis Powell said. We should not postpone more direct political action while awaiting the gradual change in public opinion to be effected through education and information. Business must learn the lesson long ago learned by other self-interest groups. This is the lesson that political power is necessary, that such power must be assiduously cultivated, and that when necessary, it must be used aggressively and with determination. Business Week added that the challenge was a difficult one. It will be a hard pill for many Americans to swallow, said Business Week, the idea of doing with less so that business can have more. Nothing that the nation has done compares in difficulty with the selling job that now must be done to make people accept this new reality. Accordingly, the U.S. corporate sector transformed itself into a political juggernaut and demanded more. The tip of their spear was campaign finance. In other words, at exactly the moment when money was becoming crucial to American politicians, U.S. corporations began deploying money to win political battles. And it worked. Under both Democrats and Republicans, government gave in to corporate demands, passing policy after policy that made the rich richer and the middle class poor. Congress began by lifting the restrictions on corporate PACs. PACs, just to oversimplify a little, are interest groups' ways of raising and spending campaign money. Congress began by lifting the restrictions that had existed on corporate PACs. This was done in 1974. Now, as the table in front of us shows, in 1974, there were 89 corporate PACs and 201 labor PACs. By 1996, the last row of our table, there were 332 labor PACs and 1,642 corporate PACs. Within 10 short years after Congress unleashed corporate PACs, that is in the period from 74 to 84, corporate PAC spending had increased by over 800%. Today, as our information in the left-hand column tells us, the campaign spending advantage of business over labor is 15 to 1. In fact, new research by the Center for Responsive Politics shows that in 2012, just one business, Koch Industries, the Koch brothers, raised and spent as much on campaigns as every labor union in the country put together. By the late, we need a new slide, Kim. By the late 1970s, corporate money had discovered two more loopholes, each of them big enough to drive a Brinks truck through. Soft money allowed unlimited contributions to political parties for, quote, party-building activities, which included making campaign commercials for candidates specified by the donor. So-called issue campaign organizations could also accept unlimited contributions and use them to make candidate commercials, so long as they avoided the magic words, vote for or vote against. To understand the limitations placed on soft money and issue organizations, all one had to do was look up. The sky was the limit on these contributions. In response to these developments, public policy became a dance macabre of progressive bills headed for the grave, says Thomas Edsel, who was reporting on it at the time for the Washington Post, and became a ticker tape parade of 1% enrichment schemes headed for the statute books. Taxes on the rich fell like wet laundry, along with protections for labor unions, whose ranks shriveled. Regressive taxes, falling most heavily on low-income workers, swelled. While other countries scrutinized and slowed the closing of their factories, the United States government, with its palm greased by major manufacturers, aided and abetted the plant closing process, giving hefty tax benefits to companies that closed plants. The rich got richer, workers got unemployment. Regulations protecting Americans from corporate overreach, corporate rapacity, those regulations vanished. In their absence, savings and loan banks went on a gambling spree in the 1980s. As their risky bets began to go bad, $2 million in hush money paid by the savings and loans to House Banking Committee members stopped re-regulation in its tracks until the total cost to taxpayers exceeded $500 billion. The man in the mugshot on the right of your screen is Charles P. Keating, president of Lincoln Savings and Loan, who profited enormously from his own gambling spree before he was sent to jail for fraud. In the 1990s, accountants without regulators forgot how to count. While the rich got richer by dint of accounting schemes at Enron, Sunbeam, WorldCom, and Quest, workers and investors lost their jobs and their savings, while government regulators were paid to look the other way. During the late 90s, over 700 U.S. corporations were found to have defrauded the public. The man in the mugshot on the left of your screen is Kenneth Lay, the CEO of Enron, another man who got very rich in the course of destroying the company. The year 2000 was the apogee of soft money, and its principal recipient, George W. Bush, with the cooperation of those other corporate favorites, the Blue Dog Democrats in Congress, returned the favor to soft money donors. In short order, the federal government gave away wheelbarrows full of taxpayer dollars to big oil, big banks, big agriculture, big insurance, and big military contractors. Bush and company were no less charitable to rich taxpayers, who got 73% of the massive tax cuts dished out in the early aughts. Together, this charity for the rich ballooned the deficit by hundreds of billions and constituted one of the largest transfers of wealth from have-nots to haves in American history. Beginning in the 1990s, Wall Street began delivering $5 billion worth of lobbying and campaign contributions to Congresses, presidents, and bank regulators. In turn, the feds gave Wall Street carte blanche, a blank check to make a killing, and kill Wall Street did, with a housing scam that was a license to print money. When the scams bubble finally burst, it became the Great Recession. Its cost included a doubling within 1 year of the unemployment rate to double digits. Other costs of the campaign money-induced recession include a crashed GDP that even by 2013 was still $850 billion below normal and is not expected to recover until 2017. A loss of net worth to U.S. households of $15 trillion. A skyrocketing national debt fueled by lack of investment, which went from 66% of GDP in 2008, that's our debt, to 103% by 2013. A drop in the income of the average male worker to less than what he'd have earned in 1968, adjusted for inflation. A dramatic rise in poverty among what were once middle-class families. The number of suburban households in poverty increased by 53% during the recession. The most recent development in campaign finance has been the Supreme Court's decisions in Citizens United versus FEC and SpeechNow.org versus FEC. These have opened broad new boulevards to corporate spending and to super PACs. Super PACs are very small groups of very rich donors spending very large amounts of campaign money, more than $800 million in 2012 alone. So how unequal, after all this, how unequal a country are we today? Overall, the middle class declined from 66% to 51% of the U.S. population during this rise of the plutocracy in the years between 1970 and 2013. At the same time, the upper class increased its share of the national income from 29% up to 46%. Here are a few more indices of how unequal a society we've become. The United States ranks 64th in income equality. This means that we lag behind all of the developed world and much of the underdeveloped world in income equality. The ratio of CEO to worker pay in the United States in 1980, near the start of this class war, was 42 to 1. This put us in the company of the most unequal countries, but at least we were close to some other countries in our level of inequality by this measure. Today, the ratio is 475 to 1 and leaves us 10 times more unequal by this measure than any other country. Our nation's wealthiest 400 families now enjoy more wealth than the bottom 50% of our country's population. Since the recession began, 95% of all income growth has gone to the richest 1% of the population. In case you're wondering whether that last number means that inequality is growing faster over time, the answer is yes, and here's why. It's because inequality and political power are mutually reinforcing tendencies. The political offensive of the wealthy caused their incomes to go up, which makes them politically more powerful, leading to more wealth, and so on, in a growing snowball that becomes an avalanche of inequality. There are, of course, many suspects in the case of America's burgeoning inequality. But the buying of elections and of public policy that took place during this era might just be the godfather of it all. I said earlier that for the most part, we pursue our own interests in politics. So let me close with a couple of quick observations about inequality, and in particular about why inequality is bad for all of us, is bad for the rich, is bad for the middle class and the poor alike. The first reason is that inequality hurts a society's health. For decades, a British epidemiologist named Richard Wilkinson has studied why some societies are healthier than others. He found that what the healthiest societies have in common is not that they have more income, more education, or more wealth. They don't necessarily have that, but that what they do have is more equitably shared. In fact, it turns out that not only disease, but a whole host of social problems, ranging from mental illness to drug use, are worse in unequal societies. In his latest book, The Spirit Level, Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better, Wilkinson details the pernicious effects that inequality has on society. Eroding trust, increasing anxiety and illness, encouraging excessive consumption, lowering life expectancy, increasing mental illness, teen birth rates, violence, the percent of populations in prisons, and drug use. All these things were not just a little bit worse, but much worse in more unequal countries, Wilkinson writes. Now the good news is that increased equality has the opposite effect. Statistics show that communities without large gaps between rich and poor are more resilient and their members live longer, happier lives. The second problem with inequality is that it's bad for the economy. The distinguished economist Joseph Stiglitz has made this argument in his book, The Price of Inequality. Much of Stiglitz's book is devoted to demonstrating that excessive inequality amounts to sand in the gears of capitalism, creating volatility, fueling crises, undermining productivity, retarding growth. Just as discrimination results in the failure of a nation to make the best use of all its citizens, inequality, when it leads to inadequate schooling, housing, and neighborhood conditions for large numbers of people, acts in a similarly destructive fashion. Stiglitz succinctly summarizes his own argument. So I'll quote him here. Inequality leads to lower growth and less efficiency. Lack of opportunity means that our most valuable asset, our people, is not being fully used. Many at the bottom or even in the middle are not living up to their potential because the rich, needing few public services and worried that a strong government might redistribute income, use their political influence to cut taxes and curtail government spending. This leads to underinvestment in infrastructure, education, and technology, impeding the engines of growth, says Stiglitz. Finally, this political offensive, this political war waged by the corporate sector, is killing the American dream, the dream of upward mobility, the dream of rags to riches. This is because the corporate war involves attacks on the engines of upward mobility, attacks on government spending on education, health, housing, welfare, attacks on labor unions, job training, public sector jobs, attacks on workers' pensions and benefits, all the things that give people a solid footing from which to move up in the world. Mobility in the U.S. has slowed to a crawl and put us behind much of the developed world. In fact, one recent headline put it this way: the American dream is alive and well and living in Finland. Here is some of what that story says, and the data is on your screen. Quote, several studies released in recent years suggest that, contrary to popular opinion, Americans enjoy significantly less upward mobility than citizens of a number of other industrialized nations. German workers have 1.5 times the mobility of Americans. Canada is nearly 2.5 times more mobile. Denmark is 3 times more mobile. Norway, Finland, Sweden, and France are all more mobile societies than the United States. Of the countries included in the studies, the United States, once the home of the American dream, ranked near the bottom in upward mobility. Let me close this talk with a little vignette about Ben Franklin. As our Constitution's writers were concluding their work, and Franklin was leaving what is now called Constitution Hall, a woman approached him in the streets of Philadelphia and asked, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And Franklin said, succinctly and presciently, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." For many generations since then, Americans have managed to keep the republic, meaning a government by the people. When our children and grandchildren ask us what political system we have left them, will we be able to say that we too have kept the republic, that we, like earlier generations of Americans, have pushed back the pretender to the throne, plutocracy, and that we too have kept the flame of democracy alive? Thank you, and let's go back and see if we have some more questions.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, again, just as a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, you can either use the hand icon to raise your hand or type in your question. So it looks like we have a comment or a question from Mark Stevens. Mark, go ahead.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening, Mark.
I agree with your analysis of the symptoms. I agree with the analysis of the diagnosis. But I don't agree with your conclusions as to what the solution is. Because it sounds to me like what you're saying is putting a fresh coat of paint over a rotten infrastructure. And that's not the solution. We have to go back to core principles. We have to get a Congress and a Congress members who will do their jobs and not look at it as an income platform to become a member of the upper, richer classes.
We do. And Mark, thank you for your question. It's a really good one because one of the things I feel bad about is that we didn't get to talking about what alternatives to the present situation might be. And there are a range of them that have been suggested. Some people think we need a constitutional amendment that simply says, look, spending is not speaking, and Congress can, in fact, regulate and limit the amount of people, the amount that people spend on campaigns. Other people feel as though we don't need a constitutional amendment. We just need a slightly altered Supreme Court. Since the first major campaign finance case was decided in the modern era, that was Buckley versus Vallejo in 1974, there's been a minority on the court. We've had fairly conservative courts since then. But there has been a consistent minority on the court that is willing to allow Congress to regulate big money. In the past, in American history, our Supreme Court has sometimes lagged behind public opinion and Congress and the President. That probably has something to do with the fact that Supreme Court members are appointed for life, and so when we hear from the Supreme Court, we're hearing from the sort of dead hand of past presidents to some extent. When that happened previously, and I'm thinking of the progressive era leading into the New Deal, Congress and state legislatures were passing laws that seemed modern, laws that limited child labor, laws that limited the amount of overtime and the total amount of hours that you could work. The Supreme Court struck those down, right and left, saying those violated the property rights and the contracting rights of the people who were entering into those contracts. What happened in that case was that those older members of the Supreme Court died or retired and were replaced by more progressive justices who changed their minds, who changed the court's opinion on those issues. And it may be that really a one-vote change in the Supreme Court today would have that effect. There are other folks who think we ought to go back to a more robust system of public financing of campaigns. In fact, there's a St. Lawrence graduate, his name is Nick Penniman, who's working with a well-known Harvard law professor named Lawrence Lessig. And I think the name of their website is United Republic, but they are working on this issue, and their suggestion is that we need to go to a system of public financing of campaigns the way some states have done. Arizona, Maine, maybe Connecticut. Is Connecticut possibly the third? I'm not quite sure, but those states have gone to a robust system of public financing of campaigns, which tends to take the big money out of politics, the special interest money out of politics. So again, Mark, thank you for your question. It really got us to the issue of what is to be done about all this.
Thank you, Mark. All right, it looks like we have a few typed in questions, so we'll come back to those. Let's see. Will you discuss the role of campaign consultants in the corruption of politics? So you've touched on that. Do you want to, the question from Peter Wolf.
Right. Well, campaign consultants are, of course, simply people who are professionals in the running of campaigns. Many people think that the influence of campaign consultants has been somewhat pernicious, perhaps because there have been some famous campaign consultants who directed campaigns in slightly unseemly ways, directions. Maybe the most famous of them was Lee Atwater, who ran the George Bush 1988 campaign. Later developed brain cancer and sort of had a deathbed conversion and confession that what he did was somewhat scurrilous. But he created a campaign that was based on furloughs, on flags, on lots of things that were hot button issues, but that really weren't the important issues for the American public. Campaign consultants are paid to win, and so their tendency is to do whatever it takes. Of course, candidates are in the mix as well, and have to tell their campaign consultants no when the campaign consultant wants to go too far. So yeah, why don't I leave it at that?
Okay. We've got another question here from Tracy White, question and comment. It says, is it possible that this current condition was preordained by virtue of the fact that the authors of our Constitution were an educated elite? And then the second part to that question is, was the Electoral College the first action to disenfranchise the citizen voter?
Well, let me say a word about the founders. As you probably know from your St. Lawrence history classes, the founders were not great Democrats in the sense that they didn't have enormous faith, unlimited faith in the wisdom of the people. On the other hand, our founders were more democratic in their thinking than the political elites of most other nations at the time, and they gave us a constitution that is more democratic. I should say more Republican, small r, in the sense that what they gave us was not a direct democracy where you and I make the decisions ourselves, but rather a democracy where we elect representatives who then make decisions for us. Now, the founders, let me take a passage from James Madison to illustrate the point I'm making. Madison said, whilst all authority in the new Constitution will be derived from and dependent upon the people, so that's Madison the Democrat talking, those people will be, Madison said, broken up into so many interest classes and partitions of citizens so that no majority of them will be able to tyrannize over a minority. So the founders were sort of with Winston Churchill, I suppose, thinking democracy is not a great form of government, it's just that all the others are so much worse. They wanted to create a government that was dependent on the people, but also that had checks and balances where the people's views were muted and modified. So, as the questioner says, they gave us an electoral college that actually elected our presidents. The people did not do so directly, and that remains the case today. They gave us a Senate that was indirectly elected. People did not directly choose the Senate. Usually state legislatures chose the U.S. Senate, and so on. So the founders were not pure Democrats by any means, but their thinking was more democratic than that of other folks at the time. And I believe firmly, based on the writings of the founders, that they would have been appalled at the condition that we have come to today of special interest power in American politics.
Okay, we have another question from Catherine Clyde. It says, would you say that the real tragedy for the average American was not what corrupt companies were able to get away with before the bottom fell out, for example, with the housing collapse, but that they were largely able to get politicians to bail them out when they fell under the weight of their own dishonest or poor management practices like GM, Bank of America, Chrysler, JP Morgan, etc.?
Right, right. Well, as one writer has said, you know, when you're too big to fail, so that you know that the government is going to bail you out, and the big banks had that sense strongly, then actually gambling is a pretty good business model. If you lose, government bails you out. If you win, you get rich. And so both in the S&L scandal and in the more recent housing recession, we've had instances of big players rolling the dice and coming up rich themselves and sort of crashing the country, coming up craps as far as the rest of us were concerned. Another interesting thing to note about this recession, talking about increasing inequality, at the end of the savings and loan scandal, which took place in the 80s and early 90s, there were lots of prosecutions. And again, the accounting fraud scandal, there were prosecutions. We saw the mugshots of Charles Keating and Kenneth Lay earlier in our presentation. After the Great Recession, when more fraud and more illegality had occurred than in either of those earlier scandals, there were no federal prosecutions. Has not been one to this date, a federal prosecution of a bank officer who committed fraud in the housing scandal. And believe me, there was fraud aplenty to choose from. But I think the fear is you prosecute a big figure on Wall Street and it sends a shiver through all of Wall Street, and they're too big to fail. When they get the shivers, our stock market starts to crash. So there's been a very tender approach to the perpetrators of the Great Recession in the wake of it.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Great.
We've got one here from, I believe it's Laura Ravenau. She types in, she says, given the political will necessary to affect the constitutional, campaign financing, and or judicial changes that you've identified, how might we understand the role of individual citizens in this process? Recognizing, of course, both the structural and systemic constraints placed on them, as well as their agency within and potential resistance to those systems.
Wow, Laura, I thought you were my friend, and now you've given me a terribly tough question for our very last question. I would, if I were a citizen looking for something to do about the role of special interest money in politics, I would go probably to the websites of Common Cause, which is still a leader in this movement. I would go to Nick Penniman's website. Again, I think that's called United Republic, but if you just Google Nick Penniman's name, his most recent venture will come up. And they'll have specific strategies and actions that citizens can take. Al Franken, the U.S. Senator from Minnesota, is currently sponsoring a proposal to repeal Citizens United, and one could join up with that. Implicit in your question, Laura, is the very, very good observation that amending the Constitution of the United States is very, very hard to do. In the 1980s, the Equal Rights Amendment had the support of a vast majority of Americans, but it never became law because of the difficulty of amending the Constitution. I think that's a tough way to go. And my own feeling would be that, again, getting a more progressive justice on the court in lieu of one of the conservatives, and then getting public financing back into the system might be better or more feasible avenues to go. But again, great question, Laura.
Dr. Exu, is there anything else that you'd like to share in conclusion?
I would just like to say thank you so much to our audience tonight. It has been, as we used to say in the 60s, it's been real. And thank you so much for your questions and your input and for joining us.
Well, a special thank you to Dr. Exu for taking time to be with us tonight, and thank you to all of you for participating. I would ask that you take a moment at the end of the webinar to complete the very brief survey that will come up on your screen when we end tonight. Your feedback will certainly help us shape future lectures in this series. And I did want to also invite you to participate in our next online Laurentian lecture, which is scheduled for April 30th at 7 p.m. You will receive an email invitation, as you often do, to this next lecture. It will be with Dr. Ana Estevez, who is an associate professor here at St. Lawrence in both biology and psychology. And she's going to be talking with us about neurocognitive enhancement. So if you have any interest in that topic, be on the lookout for that email, and I hope that you'll join us for that lecture and future lectures in this series. So thank you so much, and have a great night, everyone.